For centuries, Rome was not merely the capital of empires. It was the stage of an invisible war, a war for the soul of faith. In the silent catacombs, apostles walked with blood upon their feet. In the gilded palaces, crowns weighed heavier than crosses. Peter, the fisherman, was entrusted with the keys. Yet across the ages, the hands that bore them shifted between saints and traitors, martyrs and usurpers. The throne of Peter was built upon eternal promises. But it was also besieged by ambition, pride, and shadows that crept beneath the sacred dome. This is not merely the story of popes. It is the story of a secret battle between heaven and corruption, between the rock and the abyss. If you dare to cross the valley of redemption, you shall see that Christ's promise never failed. But you shall also see how near the altar there have always lurked those who seek to defile it. Prepare yourself. The story you are about to hear is not merely about men. It is about the fire that forged the faith and the shadows that sought to extinguish it. Rome. Not merely the heart of an empire, but the womb where the Christian faith would take root amidst ruins, blood, and silence. It was there that two men, Peter and Paul, walked with death ever at their heels. It was there that, beneath the weight of the cross and the lash of the beasts, the roots of the church drove themselves deep into the stone heart of the eternal city. Beneath the altar of St. Peter's Basilica lie the bones of the one to whom Christ entrusted an impossible mission: to guard the faith in a world on the brink of being devoured by darkness. Simon, the fisherman of Galilee, became Peter, the rock, but the rock bled. On the last night of his life, Peter refused to die in the same manner as the Master. He asked to be crucified upside down, for he deemed himself unworthy to mirror the glory of the one he had denied thrice. There, amidst the screams of Nero and the shadows of the circus, not merely a man was executed, an invisible throne was raised, a throne forged in martyrdom and tears. Before he fell, Peter sealed his succession. He left behind disciples, he left the keys. And every pope, from Linus to Cletus, from Clement to Sylvester, would not merely be a leader, he would be a link in the chain of fire that would withstand empires, plagues, invasions, and betrayals from within. Yet from the very beginning, the weight of the spiritual crown brought with it the temptation of power. And where there is power, there are cracks. Rome would burn many times over, and the bark of Peter, that symbol as fragile as it is eternal, would be tossed upon seas few would dare to brave. What had begun with blood and humility would soon see ambitious hands reaching for what had been entrusted solely to faithful servants. And the throne of Peter, which ought to have reflected the heavens, would come too, to mirror the shadows of human pride. As the centuries passed, the rock of Peter endured, but the world around it crumbled. The empire that had once crucified apostles now collapsed beneath the weight of its own corruption. And as Rome fell, the church, born amidst catacombs and prisons, began to rise as the sole beacon of order amidst the chaos. Gregory, the Great, a monk withdrawn from the world, was dragged to the throne of Peter. Against his will, yet with a clear mission, he reformed the clergy, purified the liturgy, and rekindled faith among barbarian peoples. Under his command, the church became a refuge for pilgrims, a school for kings, and a voice for the forgotten. Yet every step into the light also summoned new shadows. The thirst for secular power crept into the corridors of faith. Emperors sought to subjugate bishops. Nobles attempted to purchase the altar, and thus the throne of Peter, born from an inverted cross, found itself threatened, not by the spears of the world, but by the hands that kissed the church's rings even as they plotted its downfall. Amidst pacts and betrayals, there arose both saintly popes and manipulated ones. The Roman See wavered between moments of glory and humiliation. The bark of Peter sailed through internal tempests as perilous as the external ones. And yet, the promise endured. The gates of hell would not prevail. Not without, however, the church first drinking to the dregs the bitter cup of corruption and conflict. There came centuries in which the bark of Peter nearly sank. In the shadow of Rome's walls, noble families vied for the see, as one would contest worldly crowns. Through profane alliances and silent betrayals, the chair that bore the legacy of the apostles was transformed into a prize for human ambition. The so-called Iron Century spared not even the dead. Pope Formosus, after his death, was exhumed, dressed in pontifical vestments, and brought to trial in a macabre spectacle before a stunned crowd. The corpse, mute and cold, was condemned as unworthy, mutilated before the altars, and cast into the dark waters of the Tiber, as if violence could erase a sacred history. Yet the waters that carried away the body of Formosus did not wash away the shame of the living. Manipulated papacies, matrons dominating conclaves, illegitimate sons crowned beneath veils of power and corruption. The spiritual inheritance of Peter was desecrated by generations who no longer feared the invisible justice that weighs upon every profaned altar. And yet, even enshrouded in darkness, the light did not fade. In the silent cells of monasteries, far from the crumbling palaces, monks prayed. In the solitude of penance, seeds of renewal took root, unseen by the eyes of the mighty. It was in the shadows that God prepared the restoration. For every true ruin prepares the ground for rebuilding, and the barque of Peter, despite the storms, still floated. From the ashes of the Iron Century, something began to breathe. Not within the gilded halls of corrupted palaces, but in the chill of monastic cells, in the whisper of prayers forgotten by the world. At Cluny, in Burgundy, monks rose against the filthy tide that threatened to drown the church. They rejected the sullied hand of princes, refused the heavy coins of the nobility, and rekindled a fire that had seemed extinguished, the fire of fidelity to the gospel. The Cluniac reform spread its flame across Europe. Monastery by monastery, life by life. Holiness was once more forged in silence, sacrifice, and purity. And like sparks carried by the wind, These small resistances began to reshape the face of the papacy. Under the leadership of reforming monks, the See of Peter was, little by little, wrested from the clutches of secular politics. Pope Gregory V, the first German to assume the papal crown, and his successor Sylvester II, began an era of moral reconquest. They not only purified the papal court, they rekindled the memory of the apostolic vocation, amidst centuries of ambition and decay. Not without pain, not without conflict, but the truth endures. Where corruption sought to reign supreme, the cross was reborn, silent and inevitable. The blood of betrayals had stained the church's tunic, but the waters of tears and deserts had begun to wash it clean. Purification would not come by decree, but by silent martyrs and hidden redeemers. Yet the serpent of secular power still clutched its talons into the tunic of faith. It was not enough to purify the altars. It was necessary to confront those who sought to rule the very church with earthly scepters. Thus arose Gregory VII, a monk hardened by silence and penance, called to wear the crown that many had defiled. But Gregory did not see it as a crown. He saw it as a cross. And armed not with swords, but with excommunications, he dared to confront the mightiest empire of the age, the Holy Roman Empire. Henry IV, King of Germany, deemed himself able to shape bishops as though they were pieces upon a chessboard. Gregory answered with the invisible scourge of spiritual authority, and banished Henry from the halls of divine grace. The emperor fell. Stripped of the moral support that upheld his crown, he was forced to crawl to the frozen gates of Canossa. For 3 days and 3 nights, Henry waited in the biting cold, barefoot, clothed as a penitent, pleading for the forgiveness of an old monk who now represented the will of a throne far higher than any earthly dominion. There, beneath the snow, before mute walls and unseen witnesses, it was etched into eternity. The Church of Christ is no servant to empires, but the enemy never sleeps. Henry humbled himself only to strike anew. A few years later, he laid siege to Rome, deposed Gregory, and crowned an anti-pope as his puppet. The true pope died in exile. Yet his witness would echo through the centuries like a muffled thunder. Better to die as a servant of the truth than to live as a slave of kings. And upon the stones of humiliation, the church drove its roots deeper still, like a tree that does not fear the winter, knowing its roots are anchored in the eternal. But the storm that began at Canossa was but a forewarning. The history of the church and the papacy would follow ever darker paths, where faith and ambition would dance upon invisible chasms. At the heart of the Renaissance, whilst artists raised domes and painted heavens upon stone, the throne of Peter became the target of new sieges, now cloaked beneath velvet robes and gilded packs. Leo X, son of Lorenzo de' Medici, ascended the papacy bearing upon his shoulders both the glory of the arts and the weight of a slumbering corruption. Under his pontificate, the old Basilica of St. Peter was torn down to make way for Michelangelo's design, a work destined to touch the heavens, yet whose foundation was paid with the tarnished coins of human vanity. To finance the impossible, indulgences were sold like wares in a marketplace, and across the squares of Europe, the clinking of coins into coffers echoed louder than the murmuring of prayers. It was then that from the shadows of the abbeys, the fury of a monk arose, Martin Luther. His denunciation exploded like lightning at the heart of Christendom, rending the fabric of unity that had sustained the West. What began as a whisper became a schism. What was meant to be a reform became a war. And as priests, princes, and peasants chose their sides, the very papacy bled between two worlds, striving to be, at once, a spiritual shield and a political sword. The Council of Trent became the desperate reply. 18 years of doctrinal battles, where every word, every dogma was forged like a blade to defend a besieged faith. There, beneath the weight of oil lamps and the fear of error, the Counter-Reformation rose, and from it would emerge a new pope, a soldier clad in white, pious fear harsh, incorruptible, shaped by Dominican discipline. Pious fear restored order where chaos had reigned, purified profaned altars, and united Christian kings under one last crusade. And it was under his command that blood was spilled at Lepanto upon waters stained red, where the Muslim fleet was crushed, and, for a fleeting moment, the Mediterranean once more reflected crosses instead of crescents. But the price of spiritual survival had been high. The wound of the schism would never fully heal. And in the whispered prayers of monasteries, a new threat was already stirring. A threat not born of weapons, but of reason. Rationalism and enlightenment were sharpening their invisible blades. And the next battle would not be fought with swords or crusades, but with ideas, treaties, and declarations that would dare to challenge even the very existence of faith itself. The 18th century dawned beneath a strange sky. No longer were barbarian troops threatening the throne of Peter, nor pagan princes launching desperate crusades. Now, the threat came clad in philosophy, armed with quills and treaties that mocked the unseen. The Enlightenment, with its promises of pure reason and freedom without God, ignited salons, pulpits, and academies. And as kings trembled before the revolutionary gale, the papacy found itself cornered within invisible trenches. Pius VI, who sought to resist the tides of blood and cold logic, would end as a prisoner of Napoleon, carried off like a living trophy, humiliated before a world that no longer feared either altar or cross. Yet faith does not perish with the imprisonment of a man, and in the dust of revolutions, the Church still breathed. It was Pius IX who bore the heaviest burden. During his pontificate, he witnessed the collapse of the Papal States, the loss of Rome, and the transformation of the pontiff into a prisoner within the Vatican itself. 32 years of silent battle. 32 years in which the world modernized by force, and faith to many became a relic of superstitious ages. Yet, amidst the political ruin, Pius IX carved two dogmas into eternity: the Immaculate Conception and papal infallibility, raising over the shattered stones of the old order a doctrinal fortress that even time could not demolish. The storm would pass, the world would change, but the rock, though battered, would not be moved. In the 20th century, the bark of Peter would face even greater horrors. 2 world wars, totalitarian regimes, extermination camps, bombs tearing the skies apart. And amidst the crossfire, popes like Pius XI and Pius XII rose as solitary beacons, denouncing tyranny, sheltering the persecuted, resisting within the silence of modern catacombs. Accused by some, revered by others, these popes knew that in times of absolute darkness, sometimes the only way for light to survive is to extinguish its own flame. And when the dust of wars finally settled, the Church gazed towards a new horizon. Yet that horizon, too, was veiled with clouds. For the struggle between faith and world, between the visible and the invisible, between Rome and the new towers raised by human pride, would never end. It would merely change its form. At the end of the 20th century, a new storm began to darken the skies of faith. Not one of spears or pyres, but of seductive ideas, corroded philosophies and modernities that sought to rewrite what was eternal. And amidst this landscape of ruin and disillusionment, John Paul II arose, not merely a pope, but a pilgrim among the wreckage, a silent giant walking through a world in disintegration, born beneath the weight of totalitarian boots. Upon the hardened soil of Poland, he carried not mere speeches, but scars, pains carved by tyranny and resistance. His pontificate was an obstinate march against communism, a torch lifted amidst continents suffocated by despair. He fell, he bled, he faced bullets and conspiracies. Yet he remained. Wherever his feet touched, dormant embers rekindled. Hearts, long hardened by hopelessness, began to beat once more at the sound of forgotten bells. He was not a perfect shepherd. No man who bears a staff ever is. But beneath his shadow, multitudes once more lifted their eyes to the heavens, amidst doubts, amidst ruins, amidst the ashes of an era that sought to extinguish even the thirst for redemption. After his departure, Benedict XVI arose, not a warrior of the public square, but a silent guardian, a sentinel set upon the ramparts of truth in a time when every stone seemed to crack. Benedict did not seek applause. He sought the truth, and for that, he was loved in secret and opposed in the open. A man of austere erudition and burning faith, Benedict saw the unbearable weight that had accumulated upon the throne, and, in a gesture misunderstood by the world yet witnessed in silence by the heavens, he renounced, not out of weakness, but as one who understands that at times one must step back so that the sacred fire may continue to burn. And then, like a wind that changes direction without warning, Francis arrived. With him, new currents swept through the Vatican, for some a sign of hope, for others a cause of confusion. But one truth remains unshaken. The throne of Peter does not rest upon the popularity of the age, nor upon human alliances. It rests upon a promise that can never be broken. The gates of hell shall not prevail. As long as there is one knee bent in the silence of an empty cathedral, as long as there is one heart that dares to believe in the invisible amidst the ruins, the rock shall endure. Not by the strength of men, who so often falter, but because he who upheld Peter upon the waters, he who raised martyrs beneath the shadows of empire, he who breathed life into dry bones, still reigns, invisible, invincible, eternal, over the bark, battered by the waves of time. Time runs like sand through wounded fingers. Rome remains. The altar remains. Yet the battle has never ceased. Every pope who ascended the throne of Peter bore upon his shoulders not merely the crown of honor, but the invisible weight of the eternal war between heaven and the abyss. Saints were crowned, and so were traitors. Martyrs fell in blood, while usurpers smiled beneath gilded domes. The bark of Peter sailed through calm seas and scourging storms, battered by heresies, besieged by empires, pierced by the invisible spears of human pride. The century has changed, yet the winds that sweep over the Vatican still carry the same scent: hope and betrayal, faith and shadow, glory and ruin. Whilst cities rise in arrogance and the kingdoms of men crumble beneath their own sins, the promise made to Peter remains alive, like an eternal ember beneath the ash of history. A promise engraved not in marble, but in blood, in prayer, in hidden fidelity. That fidelity which the eyes of the world ignore, but which heaven never forgets. You may gaze upon Rome today, with its monuments, its altars, its ancient corridors. You may be captivated by its beauty or scandalized by its scars. But never forget, the throne of Peter is more than a chair of gold. It is a battlefield unseen, where angels still contend, where shadows still whisper, and where redemption is still forged with every breath of every believer. The history of the popes is not merely a succession of names. It is the living narrative of a combat where the enemy never sleeps. And so long as faith endures, even if reduced to a single spark in the midst of the night, the rock shall not be overcome. Hell itself may roar, yet in the end, the bark, though broken, though scourged, shall reach the harbor. And when that day comes, every tear, every martyrdom, every knee bent in the secrecy of the catacombs shall be counted, not as weakness, but as victory, as eternity wrested from the hands of time. Because the rock endures. Because the valley of redemption never closes for those who dare to cross it.